One of the best ways to understand any battlefield is to walk it, and that's one of the things that we do here on the old front line. And today we're on the Somme. We're walking the ground in the approach to Hawthorn Ridge near Beaumont-Hamel. And this is one of the more famous parts of the Somme battlefield because it was filmed by Geoffrey Malins, an official cinematographer, and photographed. So some of the most potent images of the Somme, some of the most potent film were taken of this part of the battlefield. And I've walked now up a track to the area that's roughly in no man's land. And on the first day of the Somme, British soldiers from the Royal Fusiliers attacked across this ground. They sent an advance party up to the lip of a mine crater, the explosion of which was filmed by Geoffrey Malins. And the idea was to send that advance party forward, capture the lip of the crater, and then allow the rest of the main party to advance. But the reality was that when they got up here, the Germans had reacted very quickly to the explosion of this mine, and a firefight then ensued around the lip of the crater. And when the main advance began and the rest of the Royal Fusiliers made their attack across this ground here, they came under withering German machine gun fire. And then a second battalion in this area had to then be employed, and that was the 16th Middlesex. And they advanced from over there near to a position called White City up the slopes of the ridge of Hawthorn Ridge towards the crater. And where I'm walking is towards one of the little battlefield cemeteries on this part of the Somme, Hawthorn Ridge No. 1. And we're going to pay a visit there to some of the soldiers who fell on this part of the Somme at the beginning of the battle in 1916. I always think it's pretty poignant to walk across a piece of the old no man's land, and I'm now walking right across it here. When we look at the contemporary maps, you can see where you are, with the German positions over to my right and the British positions over towards my left. And on the 1st of July 1916, those soldiers of the Royal Fusiliers attacked right across this track where I'm walking. That battalion had come from Gallipoli. The whole division here had served in Gallipoli the previous year and fought in some of the tough battles there at Cape Helles, Krithia, and in the vineyard there. And it'd been made up with reinforcements for the time of the Battle of the Somme. But amongst it were some pretty experienced soldiers. But what they'd experienced at Gallipoli really was nothing compared to what was about to happen here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Despite that tremendous British bombardment, the Germans remained sheltered under that trommel fire, drum fire, for 7 days, deep in their dugouts here. And they emerged from them to be ready to greet the British attack. Despite the explosion of the Hawthorn mine, all those tens of thousands of pounds of explosive, it only bit the nose off of the German defences here. And so the bulk of the German defenders had survived, and that meant they were there with their machine guns and their rifle teams ready to greet the British advance. And that advance walked into the withering fire from those German defences. And when you walk this ground here, you're never very far from a British and Commonwealth cemetery. Right across this area, they're marked on the landscape by green Commonwealth War Graves Commission signs that point you to where they are. And standing here on the crest of Hawthorn Ridge, I can see many more of them, despite the one that I'm about to go and see, Hawthorn Ridge No. 1. Right across there, the Sunken Lane, Beaumont-Hamel British Cemetery. Beyond that, the Redan Ridge cemeteries. I can see the back wall of the large Serre Road Cemetery, and beyond that, the high ground at Serre, where the Northern Powers battalions were on the first day of the Somme. So you're never very far away, really, from these silent cities of the dead here on the Somme. And those losses amongst the attacking troops meant that there was very little success here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And that meant the German lines remained in the hands of the German defenders here, the 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment from Stuttgart. They were Württemberg troops, until the very end of the Battle of the Somme, when a second Hawthorn mine was blown and Scottish soldiers of the 51st Highland Division attacked across this ground, and the ground was captured. And that meant that when the pioneers and the engineers moved forward and the burial parties came up to bury the dead from that second attack, they also found the dead from the first day of the Somme, from 4.5 months before, lying out there on the wire, lying in shell holes in no man's land, lying just in front of the German trenches. Neither side had been able to bury this dead, and so in that winter of 1916-17, some small battlefield cemeteries were made here to bury those soldiers who had fallen in the Somme. And I'm just coming up to the entrance to one of them now. Walking into what is a typical little soldier cemetery of the Somme, we come in through the Portland stone and walled entrance through the bronze gate into the cemetery itself, and we can see two neat rows of graves here and the cross of sacrifice. This was a symbol placed in all of the main cemeteries from the First and Second World War here in France and Flanders. And this cemetery was made by the concentration of burials and the discovery of the dead when the offensive moved through here in the winter of 1916-17, and the front line stabilised beyond the village of Beaumont-Hamel, who nestles in the hollow just behind the cemetery there. But this has always been a special cemetery for me, not just because I interviewed veterans who fought here on the first day of the Somme, but a connection to one of the men buried in here, Eric Heaton. I knew his sister, and Eric's sister really lived in the shadow of the loss of her brother here on the 1st of July 1916. He had many aspirations to travel the world, to follow in the footsteps of their father, who was a vicar, and he wrote an incredible last letter home from the village of Auchenvillers, Ocean Villas, just behind the British lines there on the eve of the Battle of the Somme. And it's his grave that we're going to have a look at now. Back in the 1980s, when I first visited this cemetery, I came across Eric's headstone and saw that from the cemetery register his parents lived in Hove in Sussex. And being a Sussex boy, I thought, well, Heaton's not a very common name in Sussex. So when I got home, I looked him up in those days, in the pre-internet days, in the library, in the local phone books. And there were 3 Heatons, and I wrote to them all. One never wrote back. One said, I'm not a relation, but good luck. And the other said, here is a photograph of him because he's my brother. And that was Irene Heaton. Her brother Eric had been killed here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and really in many ways that she'd lived almost the whole of her life in the shadow of his loss here in 1916. She'd never married, and that's how I traced her, because when I quizzed her about this, she said, well, really Eric for me was the epitome of what a young man should be, and I felt that no other man could really ever live up to that. And when I went to visit her, her room was like a shrine to him. There were photographs, there was his medals, his memorial plaque, she had all of his letters, there was even a lock of his hair. And in 1919, the family visited this part of the battlefield when it was just an utter wasteland, when there was nothing but shell holes and barbed wire, the remains of the trenches and the dead buried out on the fields and in the small cemeteries like this everywhere. And it's an incredible journey that they must have made just to actually get here, really, in many respects. And they stood there behind the grave. She knelt at the grave, almost in prayer. And the brother, the chaplain, her eldest brother, who'd been an army chaplain in the Great War, took a photograph. And that photograph to me says so much about how families mourned for the dead and those incredible journeys that they did take to come to places like this to remember. And then, of course, it was a wooden cross. But one thing they did do was place that plaque in front of that cross. And here we are more than a century later, and I'm pleased to say that it's still here. A remembrance of a family's journey, a remembrance, a beacon almost to a family's loss here on the battlefields of the Somme in 1916.